Hi everyone, welcome back. So we're going to start diving into the problem solving process, looking at some examples, but more importantly getting a deep understanding of what the steps that we've shown before are and why they're relevant and how to use them in an on-the-fly sort of situation, right? This is not an academic sort of training. You're not supposed to write these things down all the time, even though you will write them down sometimes. So that said, let's dive right in. And the first step is, of course, defining the problem. Now, I want to leave you first with a quote that I really, really like from Albert Einstein. And I think this quote is extremely important, and I'm going to be probably coming back to it. Elon Musk has a similar one that you're going to see in the next video. But basically, formulating the problem is way more important and much harder than actually solving it. Because when you define the problem, solving it most of the time, not always, but most of the time, becomes a matter of mechanical skill, right? It's either math or some sort of experimentation or statistics or whatever it is. But defining the problem is usually the much more elusive part and much more ambiguous part. So I love this quote by Einstein. I thought I'd share it with you first because it really represents the heart of what problem solving is. Now, so we saw the 6 steps in the previous video. We're going to start with the first step. And again, in the first step, think impact, right? Think what is the problem that will create impact for the client or for my business or for the company I work for. That is a way to navigate the ambiguity with a starting point. The question I get quite often is, okay, but I don't know what the starting point is. Well, start with impact and then drill deeper from there. And we're going to see why in a second. Now, you should really care about problem definition, even in an interview context, for several reasons. One, it's what avoids getting you into rabbit holes, going down useless routes, doing unnecessary analyses, creating more room for error for yourself, making mistakes, even in an interview context. If you haven't defined the problem very well, you will find yourself ending up in areas that are not necessary and at the same time usually more complex. So you will be more likely to make mistakes. And same thing in real life, same thing if you're running your own business. So really, really spend some time in a mode where you're trying to define a crisp question to ask. Second thing, if you're interviewing or if you're meeting a business partner or something like that, it's defining the problem is really what forms the first impression. And particularly in the case of consulting interviews, your interviewer is going to notice right away if you're defining the problem well or not. It's the first thing you talk about, and at the same time, frankly, it's the thing they're very, very well trained for. You spend a lot of time in consulting on defining problems and trying to distill them into discrete questions. The third thing is when you define a problem very well, you've established a source of truth to go back to when you end up in like a ton of different interdependencies and analyses and all that kind of stuff. So when also in an interview you're running into a wall or something and your interviewer made a mistake, and that happens, by the way, you can come back to the problem definition and say, hey, I thought we were focusing only on margins for now. Should we drill into something else? If you had defined the problem to be margins. And that will help you avoid going into these useless directions. So it's a single source of truth, essentially. And then finally, and this is from running hundreds and hundreds of interviews in consulting, in tech, in startups, it is the most common mistake by far. People tend to, when they ask me about interviews, they tend to be freaking out a little bit about the math. How do I do math in my head? I don't know exactly what the drivers of a particular business problem are, yada, yada, yada. And this is the least of your concerns. The least of your concerns is doing math. You can mechanically do that, and nobody expects you to be perfect at it. But the mistake that most people make is jumping into analysis mode right away, or jumping into answers right away without defining the problem. And like I said, that's the one thing that your interviewer is going to be looking for very early on. Okay? Super important. Make sure you define the problem very well and practice that. Now, let's have a mental model, right? I've been talking so long for now, and you might be wondering, okay, dude, what does problem definition really mean? Or what do you mean by defining a problem? So here's a mental model for crisply defining business problems. First, you want to have one basic overarching question that is mostly focused on impact, right? And problems come in all kinds of shapes, and sometimes they're very messy. You want to take a step back, think, okay, what is really impactful here, even if I have like 15 different things going on, and what is the one that everything else sort of branches out from? So if you're doing a case or doing an actual project in real life where your client or your company is for example, running out of cash, what is it that is the root cause of running out of cash? And by the root cause here, don't misunderstand me, I don't mean the actual on the ground thing, but the high level reason or bucket that this falls under. So the overarching question should be impact focused, it should be smart, and it should also be within smart, the T is time bound. Please do not forget time bound, because it's really important and most people forget it. So like you see on the slide, an example is how can we improve gross margins from 10% to 20% within the next 12 months, right? That's a simple, easy to read, discrete question. Now, what are other components that could fall into defining a problem? One, defining success. What does success look like? That's my favorite question to ask always. What does success look like here? And be careful, we don't mean here the solution, but understanding what would be success if it happens. So in this case, it's like margins of 20% or more while maintaining all of our workforce, for example, right? And then you also want to understand the context a little bit. And a very simple way to understand context is ask yourself this: what is the situation and why is it a complication, right? And a complication doesn't have to be a negative thing, it could be a positive thing, right? It could be the situation is we're a startup and the complication is we're growing too fast for our resources, right? So that's a good thing, actually. It's a good problem to have. But basically, what is the general situation and why is that causing a complication that we need to handle, whether positive or negative? And the context is usually, industry trends, competitive threats, potentially a gap in talent, that kind of stuff. You really want to make sure that you have that in the back of your mind. And then the third thing that goes within that mental model of defining a problem is you want to understand what the solution constraints and sort of space are. And again, not the solution itself, but what are the boundaries of that solution that we're going to be solving for. So for example, we will look into cutting costs, but we won't look at increasing prices because it's intense competition nowadays. That could be a very good definition of the solution space and its constraints. And then finally, and not least important by any means, you want to understand the stakeholders. who's involved, who makes decisions, who could derail the project, etc. Now, if you're in an interview context, stakeholders quite often are not that complicated, but it's good to have that, again, in your mind, that you might want to go looking for clues in one of these 4 buckets after you've defined the overarching question very simply, very smartly, right? Okay, so we've been talking about problem definition in a more abstract way so far. So perhaps try creating the problem definition for the GM project using the mental model that we just discussed, and use the PDF called Email to GM CEO. It's in the lectures. You can view it in the lectures. Use logic, use general knowledge. No need to do research, just think about it and try to fit it into that mental model. Going forward, you're going to be able to do these things on the fly very quickly. It will be intuitive for you. That's the whole point of this course. But for now, just try to write it down and fit it within this quick mental model. Pause the video, go for it, and then I'll see you when you come back. Okay. So here's a very simple answer. And one very important point here, there is no one single textbook answer. This is just one of potential many, right? There are potential interpretations, but this is a textbook answer, one of the many. So the overarching question is, to what extent should GM invest in electric vehicle technologies, and at what pace? If you think about it, this is really the question that distills every other sub-question or potential issue that might arise, right? Like, oh, what about profitability? Is it profitable to be in electric vehicles? Well, if you answer the question of should we invest in it or not, you by definition will have to answer the question of profitability to answer the overarching question, right? And that's the dynamic you want to get into when generating these overarching questions. They are the questions that if you had answered everything else in this problem, you can answer this question, right? If you think about, okay, do we have the technology? Well, should we invest or not? In order to answer that, we have to answer the technology question. All these things will come later. But the bigger question is, should we invest or not? To what extent and at what pace, right? If you look at the document that was in the lectures, the email to the CEO, we talk about an investment approach that includes defining what technologies, capital requirements, and strategy to maximize return on capital are. The definition of success here is, for this project, if you put yourself in the project manager's shoes, you want to have a well-articulated strategy for the CEO and the board of directors. You want to have a strategy that maximizes return on capital, and you want to make sure that the leadership, which is the CEO and her main staff, and the board of directors are aligned. So that's what a definition of success for this particular project is. Now, the context, I'll let you read it. It's fairly straightforward. Same thing with the solution space. The constraints were, there were clues for that throughout the document that you read. It's the US market focused, passenger vehicles only, and that's a really good zoom in already, because, electric vehicles can be everything: buses, trucks, passenger vehicles, everything you can imagine, right? So, hey, this project is focused. These are the constraints. This is the solution space. And most importantly, we have a 10-year horizon. So we're going to try to put an investment strategy over the next 10 years and build a market outlook based on that. And then finally, the stakeholders. So in this particular case, stakeholders are actually really important because they define what kind of level are you talking about. Are we talking very tactical? Are we talking very high level? And since you're working with a CEO, you're definitely talking high level. So the CEO, board of directors, senior management, buyers, and that's really important. If you get asked that in an interview, who do you think the stakeholders are here? Never forget the customer, because again, that's something that a lot of people forget because they're focused internally. But the customer that you're selling to is the most important stakeholder. And then, of course, technology suppliers in this case, don't you think? They're a really important stakeholder because a lot of the technology is going to come from potentially other suppliers. No company on earth manufactures and invents everything it does, not even Apple. And then finally, regulators. Since this is the car manufacturing space is a relatively regulated space, especially when it comes to emissions and environment, regulators play an important role. So that's why we have them on this slide. Now, 2 quick notes here. One, if you didn't write it like this, or if you missed a lot of this, don't panic. That's totally normal. Nobody expects you to be perfect in an interview, or even in real life. You will iterate over this multiple times, right? This is a textbook answer that I developed, and with others as well, by iteration. And this is the final product. You can't get it right 100% from the very beginning. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, I get a lot the question of, hey, for the overarching question, I get lost, I get stuck on where to start. So here's a very quick tip. Think about the economics and the stakeholders, what the economics dictate and what the stakeholders are going to care about. And very often, this is where your overarching question is hiding. The board of directors and the CEO could not care less about if electric vehicles are, say, going to take market share or not. They couldn't care less about that fundamentally. The reason they care about it is because, hey, if we don't invest in them and they take all the market share, we're essentially screwed. So there you go. Probably is a question of investing. And then I have a question for all of you. Which stakeholder have we forgotten here? There's one stakeholder that is actually missing on purpose. That is extremely important. So think about it for 10 seconds or something. Okay. It is shareholders of General Motors. Again, a trick that a lot of people trick themselves into is forgetting not just about the customer, but about the shareholder. If you think about a company, these are your 2 main stakeholders as a company that you have almost moral responsibility towards. You want to make sure your customers are served well, and you want to make sure your shareholders, the people you work for, the people who own the company, are getting the best return on their investment in the company. Can't tell you the number of interviews where people have forgotten about shareholders when we were discussing who the key stakeholders are in a particular problem. And again, if you had identified shareholders of GM, that's a really good start, because that will push you to think, wait, if that is the main stakeholder, then what shareholders care about is return on investment. So the question is really, should we invest? How and how much return are we going to get, right? So that sort of pushes you to define the overarching question. So yeah, that's all I've got on introducing problem definition as a concept. We're going to practice a lot more with cases. But the key things to remember, just to summarize: problem definition, never ignore it. It's super important, more than you think. Don't rush into other things. 2, use the definition of success and the stakeholders when you understand what those are in the situation to arrive at a basic overarching question that will, if you blow that question up, it will include in it all the other questions, and that's the most important thing to do in problem definition, arriving at that overarching question. So yeah, hope that was useful. Let me know if you have any feedback, and I'll see you in the next video.